Hey everyone, it's Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Now, getting started in property, wherever your situation, can be intimidating. So we're going to go back and look at what we did and what we would change. But then more importantly, we will give you a guide to what you should be doing, whether you're starting out with no funds or a lot of funds. However you're getting started, there's a path forward for you.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. In case you don't know, we run a business that buys more than £100 million worth of property every year for our clients. You can find out more about that at propertyhub.net/invest. But we've not always been operating at that scale. We started a long time ago, sadly, and we started small. But because we've been through every stage of the investing journey, in this episode, we're going to share what we did, what we learned, what we would do differently, and give you some ideas about what you can be doing to be making the most progress wherever you're starting from.
So it's time for our news story of the week, and this week's news story comes from the Mortgage Strategy website. I know all of you will be in that website daily, but just in case you missed this news story, because it is important, the headline reads, "Mortgage approvals hit highest level in 2 years, according to the Bank of England." Rob, that's really, really good news, because interest rates, as we all know, up until very recently, have only gone up. We've had a little cut recently, but it's only been a little cut. But that seems to have been enough to bring a tremendous amount of positivity to the property market.
It has, yeah. And it seems like it may get even better because it seems like rates are very much on a downward trend. So we could see another cut this year. But I think what this is all about is that people ultimately need to move, to transact, to buy and sell. And they've been prevented from doing so by a whole lot of uncertainty, by the mortgage market being absolutely all over the place for the last couple of years. I can't remember any period for the mortgage market like what we've been through recently. Now that has calmed down and we're starting to see that reflected in the figures. So you certainly can't say that everything is perfect in the country or that it's easy to be a home buyer, but certainly good to see these figures on the up. And this is just one piece of data that we pulled out, Rob. Lots more to cover, but I think we'll save that for the market update next week.
Yeah, there's loads to cover in the market update. I can't wait to get into it. And we're going to get into a bit of an economics rant as well. So you must join us next week for that episode.
Rob and I have both been investing in property for a long time. But what would we do if we started again? Clearly, we wouldn't do everything in exactly the same way as we actually did, both because of the lessons we learned and because the world's changed a bit over the time that we've been investing. And the benefit of this episode for you is that we've been through every stage. We both started scrapping around to buy our first buy-to-let, and we've moved through different stages, including stages where we've had more capital available to grow our portfolios faster. So whichever point you're starting from or growing from right now, you'll be able to learn from our experiences and probably avoid a few of our mistakes as well. So Rob, to put everything we're going to talk about in context, we need to briefly talk about how we actually did get started in property. And I don't actually know much about your earliest days, so enlighten us. What was the Rob Bent's property awakening like?
Well, Uncle Cuthbert dropped a couple of mil in the bank and off I went.
I was getting those vibes from you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Uncle Cuthbert didn't exist. But cheap property in my area where I was living at the time did exist. So my first property was money scrapped together. I luckily got myself a job where I could earn bonuses and commission, and I made a change in my life in my early to mid-20s when I decided to use that money for things other than the weekend. And I put it to good use. And the first one was a cheap property. So cheap that it remains cheap today, many, many, many years later. And we absolutely will get onto what we would do differently. But you know what? I don't regret that investment because it got me started. And I didn't need much of a deposit back then either because it was pre-08 and the world was very different. My second property came a few years later. And when you are starting off with low funds, that's typical. And I know this is a big frustration for people who are starting off. For a lot of people, you need to take time to put money together for deposits. And that was the case. The biggest gap in buying properties was from first to second. The second one was in Leeds. And that one I also still own today. That has performed better, I'm pleased to say. That was strategically picked. The area was picked because I believed it would be good for buy-to-let prospects. It's in the city centre. It's rented well since. And that was the second one. And then the third and the fourth came along a little quicker. And what I continue to do is not necessarily sacrifice lifestyle early on, but I didn't upgrade. So when I had money coming in, instead of upgrading my lifestyle in a dramatic way, yes, I may have eaten out slightly more than I did, which was pretty much zero early on. But in terms of upgrading wardrobe, car, holidays, all those nice things, the level I was at the start continued to be the level for a long time. And then the business came along, that unlocked more wealth and more deposits, as well as the portfolio snowballing as well. And the rest, as they say, is history. I'll absolutely get into different stages with you, Rob, of what I'd change and what I'd absolutely do the same. And as you've alluded to, we'll talk about those different stages as well. But it's been really interesting to be a part of every stage, the no money stage, getting money together, having a bit more, and so on, and how you do pivot your strategy over time. Sometimes not quick enough, which we'll come to. But that was my story. Not that sexy, but just an honest start to property investment. Loads of mistakes, loads of lessons. Would I change things? Yes, of course. That's kind of the purpose of this episode. But do I regret anything with my portfolio? No.
And those very first properties, Rob, were they close to where you were living at the time?
The first one was. The first one I lived in, then moved out of and turned it into a buy-to-let. The second one, as I said, was in Leeds. And although I have lived in Leeds, I wasn't living in Leeds at the time. So the second one was very much a strategic play. So I moved quite quickly from I wouldn't say it was accidental because it was deliberate. I did want to build a property portfolio. But the safe option of buying just close to me and using it to live in to begin with and then convert it into a buy-to-let shortly after. Whereas the second one was absolutely a buy-to-let purchase. I never wanted to live in that property. I never have lived in that property. And that was an early shift I made in building a portfolio where I went from playing it safe, sticking local, being a bit scared possibly, to being very deliberate about my decisions.
And I think on the podcast, people know you as like Mr. Goals. But how much starting with the end in mind was there in this versus just like, oh, it seems like a good idea, I'm going to try it?
Oh, early on, it's just goals galore. And I keep finding old notepads with goals written down, but also progress journals. And it's really interesting to look back at that young, hungry version of me today. I'm still absolutely hungry and I still have big goals. They're a lot more focused now. Reading back my thoughts from back then, I just remember the energy and the drive that I had. And I think it's a powerful tool. If you are listening to this and you're young, if you don't have a lot of money, what you do and hopefully should have is a lot of drive and a lot of ambition. And you can channel that. It's powerful stuff. When you get a little older, because we're only a little older, Rob, we're not old. When you get a little older, maybe some of that disappears. You start to settle a little bit. You get a bit comfortable. But early on, if you've got that hunger, that drive, that it's powerful, powerful stuff.
It is. It's not like you just have it when you're young, then it dissipates over time. Not everyone has it, but occasionally we'll come across people or hear from people who have it. And when someone has it, it's really obvious. And that is something you should definitely be harnessing. I think how we each got started, we've got a lot in common, so I won't talk in detail about what I did, because a lot of it's covering the same ground. For me, I was less quick to decouple the portfolio location from my location. So I was living in London at the time, and back then you could buy, believe it or not, a cheap property, relatively speaking, in London. I had to go a few miles away to a less than salubrious location to get to find a property that I could afford to get started, but you could do that. And I clung on in London for as long as I can before getting to the point of like, okay, this just really doesn't work anymore. Where should I go next? And in my case, there wasn't such an obvious goal. It was very much something I stumbled into. So I managed to buy my first property from savings, and I never thought about myself as making lifestyle sacrifices, but I think I was just like a natural cheapskate for my entire 20s and most of my 30s. So that kind of happened anyway, not thinking to upgrade the lifestyle, and so the savings built up. And then I exited a small business that I was running with a partner and got bought out of that at a low level, but that was enough to push things a little bit further. But the whole way through that, there really weren't these great goals or much of a plan. I think I was doing a thorough job of analysing the property and the opportunity and making sure that the numbers added up, but it wasn't all in service of some great goal. It was just like, well, I've got some money, I want to do something with it. Property seems like the thing. Then I got gradually sucked into it from there. And I think that's probably quite common. We talk a lot about goals and plans and so forth on the podcast, and I think that is a better way of doing it. But ultimately, like you said, Rob, we're just getting started is the main thing. And once you do something and you start that learning and you start to see the results, then it kind of builds its own momentum from there.
It's interesting because, like you've said, London was a good place to invest when you started. Was that luck a little bit by design or very much by design? You'd worked out that London was the place to be and that's where you're going to allocate your funds.
Oh, it was 100% luck. It didn't cross my mind to invest anywhere else because I wanted to be super hands-on. That's not even accurate. Like, I thought you had to be super hands-on. I wasn't even aware that there was another way of doing it. So I was going to do all the viewings myself. Someone needed to come and deliver a washing machine or something. I'd be there taking the keys round and waiting for them myself. I was doing everything. And so it had to be close to home. So it's pure fluke that these cheap properties that I was buying at the time are still cheap relative to everywhere else in London. But the entire London market went through this huge growth spurt. And even though the areas I was buying in were not the best, the way that London works is you get areas of gentrification, which then ripple out from there. So the areas are still not great, but they're a lot better than they were. So I've benefited twice over, but there was no plan to that at all.
There was absolutely no plan with my first property. And I've not had that same luck because I think it's worth roughly what I bought it for all those years ago. Like I said, though, it got me started, so I don't regret it. But would I change it? If I was being more strategic today, would I look at my area and then look at others and go, is there a better place to invest? Yes, that would be the first change. At the beginning, that's what I would change. And it sounds like you would too, Rob. Now, when I started, Rob, I was absolutely trying to educate myself and learn more about market cycles and the economic side rather than learning to run a buy-to-let portfolio. I don't think I spent, with what I'm like, trying to look back at the younger version of myself. And it'd be great to say, oh, that person, he was right on it with all the regulations and stuff. But I know I wouldn't have been. So I spent time more on the macroeconomics of property and the economy and things like that because I found it really interesting. I'm not saying I was an expert back then, far from it. It was the start of my journey. But education on buying, how to do it, how to own it, what entity to own it, none of that was on my radar early on. Was it for you? Were you studious back then, like got all the landlord manuals out and knew all the regulation that existed back then? Was that you, Rob D? Were you that guy?
This is probably why we make a good team because, yeah, I was. I was perhaps lacking in the vision, but more in the detail. Not so much from a regulation point of view, but very much in the nuts and bolts of the individual investment. So really thinking about the return, the cash return from that investment and what that return figure would be like, how it would compare to something else that I could buy a mile down the road. And I was normally buying things that needed a tidy up. We wouldn't so much call it work, but getting very into the detail of all of that. But in terms of entity and tax and all that stuff, didn't think about it at all. It just wasn't a thing back then. It wasn't something you needed to think about. Now, of course, that's very different. And I would be thinking that if I was starting now. And everything that I did do was completely self-taught. And there wasn't so much around back then. We didn't have podcasts. We didn't really have YouTube back then. Make myself sound ancient, but it's true. This stuff wasn't really around. But there were forums, books, stuff like that. And it was very much piecing together things that way rather than I'm going to go on a course for a weekend and have someone tell everything to me. And that's something that I wouldn't change because, to be fair, I probably would have benefited from a bit of a dose of inspiration and the G-up that you get from all that kind of thing. But I still really value that self-education. And I think that's given me a far more enduring base of knowledge than if I just gone and attempted to learn everything in a weekend.
You know what, Rob? I joke about how I approached it early on, but I couldn't get away with that now. You can't just start. I mean, you can, but it's going to cost you money. But you're going to feel the pain in one way or another because the way you've got your tax affairs set up may be inefficient, or you may end up with a fine because you're not doing something the right way. It's a very, very different world. So I guess I had the option of being blasé early on, but you don't really have that option anymore. And it's going to be painful if you try and take that route. Education now is in a very different place. Back then, it was more of an option. Now it's more of a necessity. And that's great for us because we can put loads of education out there on the podcast and YouTube, etc. But you do need it now. I mean, a huge one I would do differently is start with a limited company. I didn't need to start back then. So that was the right thing to do when I started in my portfolio, buying in my own name. There was probably little to no mortgages on the market anyway for people investing in limited companies back then. But the world has changed. So if I was starting again today, I would change. I would start with my circumstances, my goals and my plans to invest with a limited company. That's not tax advice, it's just what I would do. But I absolutely would change that. And I think this is interesting because we've talked about the importance of education, and we've talked about how you just can't get away with winging it anymore. But something I'm really happy with, a decision I made, and I know a decision you made, Rob, and I would keep this decision, is not spending money on expensive courses. Because the majority, if not all the information you need to become a property investor is either free on podcasts like this or the YouTube channel, or little to no cost like your books and other good books out there. Obviously yours are the best. But there's loads and loads of information out there for little to no money. So you do not need to get caught up in people selling you big dreams if you just drop 5k with them. It's not needed. They are amazing salespeople. They absolutely are. But is the knowledge worth $5,000? Can you pick it up for 50 quid tops and a bit of time invested, of consuming that information? Absolutely. Like, it's there, Rob. You do not need to find the secret sauce in these big expensive courses. Although, unfortunately, because so many people write to us after they've been through them, it still happens. People still get caught up in them. They're sold big dreams. In the majority of cases, they're left very disappointed.
Yeah, I think there's a really important distinction to be made there, because we've said that you can't really wing it in the same way as you could back then. And I think that is a really big change that's taken place just over the time that we've been podcasting, over the last, 11, 12 years or whatever. It's a long time, isn't it? But back then you didn't have to think about whether you used a limited company or not. You didn't have to think so much about location because there weren't such giant differences between different parts of the country. Lots of people who listen to this podcast are in the Southeast. Like I said, I started in the Southeast in London because where I happen to live. You just didn't have to think about it. Now, many people living in the Southeast are immediately having to get to grips with investing in a different area, which is a whole mental hurdle to get over, but it also involves developing a whole set of new research skills that you didn't need back then. And of course, on the regulation side, things have got a lot more complex. So you can't just wing it in the same way as you did back then. But that could be turned into a sales pitch for, you have to come on my course because there's this secret, this method, this whatever. No, the solution to everything I've said is not go and pay for a course. The solution is put in the work, use your time and your brain instead of your money. Because the other thing that's changed over that time, thankfully, is so much more information is out there now.
There is, but do not be overwhelmed, because another thing I would say we both keep doing is taking action. We took action early on and we continued to take action. That was the best investment we ever made. Because if we had stopped because we wanted to read a bit more or get a bit more information or wait for the market to slightly move, the taking action part was vital. Now, Rob's told you how his first few properties went really well because they were in the right area. But I didn't have that. But I've already told you that I do not regret the taking the action because it got me started. The chances are your first property investment will be your worst, or one of them at least. But it doesn't matter because that's where the real education will come in. Yes, we said listen to the podcasts and take in all the information to start so you're doing it the right way. But the real education, and this is something we've said consistently from the start of the podcast, will happen when you invest. It becomes real. The lessons become real. The challenges become real. Those challenges require solutions, and that solution you'll eventually find is wisdom. And you'll probably not get the right solution early on. You'll see that there was a better way of doing it, but that's still useful. Don't use fear as a reason of not moving forward. Use it as a driver, because it's those mistakes that are actually going to get you further on with your investment. And a lot of these things we talked about will feel slow as you build your portfolio. We talked about how early on the portfolios for both of us started slower, and that's understandable. And most of the things are just gradual, but there are some things that you do which really unlock wealth or growth or efficiencies. Like leverage, we've talked about loads, and we're not going to go on about it here because we've covered it so extensively. But the point is we used leverage early on and we continue to use leverage mortgages today. But a really interesting one, Rob, and you've talked about it on the past on the podcast, but not that often, so I want to bring it up now, is I get the sense that one of your biggest unlocks as your portfolio grew was deciding to take on a PA. Because yes, we will get to talking about the different stages of where people might be starting. But if you are a busy person, you don't have to suddenly take on a second job of a property portfolio. You can be efficient. And this, for me, felt like a real life hack. The way you talk about this, I get the sense that this just made a huge difference to you.
You're right. And it's not something that you necessarily think of at first as being a giant unlock. Because when you think about the constraints that you have to growing a portfolio, it's normally money. Of course it is. That's a constraint for everyone to some extent. And it's one that never fully goes away. There's always more property out there that you'd like to own than you have the cash to buy. But time is not talked about anywhere near as much. But it's something even more finite. It's also a constraint for everyone. And I got to a point where that was what was holding me back. My portfolio had grown over time, but also our business had grown over time, and I'd got far busier with that. I was having far more of my headspace taken up with that. And by that point, I had a family as well, which anyone with a family will know takes up even more of your time and more of your headspace. So something that was perfectly manageable became unmanageable. And I was at the point where I didn't want to grow my portfolio because for any additional property, I wasn't seeing the extra rental income, the potential capital growth that I'd have in the future. I was seeing hassle. I was looking at the stuff that I resented doing now and that was interrupting me and was just a pain and seeing more of that pain. And so the solution to that was taking on a PA, only part-time, but part-time was perfectly enough. And she took over all of that pain and, believe it or not, enjoys doing it. So all the emails, the phone calls, and importantly, the open loops in my brain, I wonder what's happening with that. Should I be chasing up this? That's probably the biggest thing. All of that went away. And suddenly I didn't have all this stuff on my plate and I had the peace of mind that things were being done properly. And so then it was like, okay, well now another property, no problem. To me, that means, yes, going through the mortgage application and the things you have to do there, but then nothing. It's all the same. Doesn't change my life. And then, yes, you're seeing the rental income. You're seeing the capital growth. So I'd never thought of it until you said it just now, Rob, in terms of it being an unlock, but it massively was. And obviously that's only one that only makes sense at a certain point. But I think one, that point might be earlier than people realize. And two, there might be an equivalent of that. There might be another kind of change or unlock or something, if you can identify the constraint for you, that can take you out of the type of plateau that I was in and push things on.
And I think you make a really important point there, Rob. The PA unlock is not for everyone starting out, because everybody will be starting out from different positions. A lot of the information that's put out is starting out as in you are starting out with little to no money, what you would do. But some people start with lots of money. Some people start with a decent amount of money. And some people start with no money. And all is fine. And what we will do now is give you some guidance on those different stages of what you would do, because we've had the privilege of going through all those stages. So we've been at a point where we had no money. We've been at a point where we've had a bit of money and been at a point where we're lucky to have a bit more money. So what should you be doing at each and every stage? Rob, started out with low to little no money. This, as I've said, gets a lot of coverage. A lot of people talk about this. And a lot of it is just common sense. It is make some lifestyle sacrifices if you can to get more money. Find a way to increase the amount of money you have. So whether it's a job that gives you commission, bonuses, or find a side hustle, find ways to build that pot of money as quickly as you can, and then invest it. Take action, and then be patient, because the next one will take a little bit of time. It sounds simple, but I think it is simple. But like, if you want to be ripped, it is simple. Go to the gym and don't eat too much. You will eventually become ripped. But it's simple to say, I'm still not ripped. It's like a lot of things in life, the simple things are sometimes hard to do. And while the formula to get it started in property is very simplistic, you will require that discipline. And the discipline is the hard part.
Yeah, and progress will be slow, but that's okay. And it's always beneficial in a way, because it gives you the time to take on that education and build up your skills, practice analysing lots of deals, even if you can't afford them quite yet. You can do that planning ahead and really immerse yourself in it. That's what I did early on. I only had the ability to make one investment, and I couldn't even do that quite yet. But I spent hours and hours and hours learning and researching, and kind of almost disproportionate for that one investment. But I enjoyed doing it, and all the skills that I built up, I was then able to apply later. So I think that's where most people start. And yeah, it feels slow, it feels frustrating, but actually the work that you're doing will pay off in the long run. But Rob, not everyone starts off in that position. We hear from people all the time who are coming into property with something. Maybe not loads, but maybe they've had a small inheritance, a small business exit. Maybe they are just one of life's savers and they've suddenly gone, hang on a minute, I've got all this money in the bank. What do I do with it? So having a different starting point probably means a different plan of action, right?
It does, because now you start to make decisions on how much you want to do yourself. Because when you're starting out, do it all yourself. Don't pay for anything. Get all the information for free. Try and do any accounts early on yourself. Of course, if you're just out your comfort zone, don't. If you can, great. Basically, when you start, don't outsource. Do as much as you can when you start with little to no money. When you come into a bit of money, that might be enough for 1 or 2 properties, maybe not necessarily in London, but in the north, you start to have choices. And you can absolutely go and find your own properties. You can absolutely go and do your own mortgages, and you can do it all yourself. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. And it depends on you and your life situation, but you may find that working with people is more efficient because you might be time poor. If you've got a lot of time, then maybe you do a lot yourself because you'll get a lot of learning and lessons. But if you're time poor, which I know a lot of people in this situation are, then working with a mortgage broker, having somebody to execute your strategy, and it depends on what your strategy is, right? If you are doing refurbs, it's bringing in tradespeople, not trying to do it all yourself. Again, if you're starting out and you're just doing your first one, the more labour and the more you can bring to a refurb, the more helpful it is. But then when you reach this sort of middle stage that we're talking about, you can work with partners. If you just want normal buy-to-lets, you can work with a company like Property Hub Invest. Check out propertyhub.net/invest if that's of interest. That's not what this episode's about. But you can work with people to help build your portfolio. You have options, basically. Money brings options. And that's a nice thing. It can also be overwhelming. But the good news is you don't have to do it all yourself if you don't want to. Maybe you've got the time, but you just don't want to, or you're a little bit scared or intimidated. Well, there are people out there to help you. What doesn't change is you don't spend that money on courses. There's no secrets there. I can promise you. We would have covered it. We've done the podcast for over 10 years. Don't think there's anything we've not talked about now. The information is all there. It's just about working with people, leveraging people to get better results. And I think, Rob, when you move into the final category, which is somebody who's got a big chunk of money to start with, it's building on top of that even further. It's taking that leverage of people even further. Because when you have a chunk of money, so we have people who come to us who've sold businesses, or maybe they're sports people who are doing very well, or they work in the city and they get big lumpy bonuses every year. There's lots of situations where you can suddenly find yourselves with big amounts of cash. And that also can be intimidating because you don't want to burn it. You don't want to make mistakes. But what you can do is leverage. Leverage, obviously, we talk about with mortgages, and absolutely should be doing that, but you leverage the skills and time of other people.
Definitely. And in a funny way, you could almost say that starting with a large amount of money is the most difficult situation to be in some way. It doesn't feel like it because, I said earlier, cash is the constraint for most people. But when you do have a lot of money, you can make more investments more quickly, which means you can get things more wrong. And you see that both in reality. Tends to be the case that people who suddenly come into a lot of money quickly feel the need to do something with it quickly and then often make mistakes as a result of that. But you also see the effect of that mentally. People find it hard to do anything because the stakes seem so high. So they end up doing nothing at all. The answer to all of it, as you've said, Rob, is making use of other people. If money isn't the constraint, then you are going to be the constraint. Either your time or your knowledge is going to be the constraint. And you can remove that in the way that I removed that from part of my life with a property PA. Whatever aspect of it is the constraint for you, whether it's finding deals or figuring out the structure or whatever it is, that can be removed. There are people who can help with that and you should use them. But very importantly, of course, you need to use the right people, because when you come into property, if someone gets wind of the fact that you've got a chunk of money to spend, there'll be a lot of people lining up to help you, but that doesn't mean that all of them are the kind of people you want to be helped by. So that's why I think the education piece that we've talked about never goes away for anyone. Getting that base of knowledge yourself before you speak to anyone, so you're not coming in completely green. You're able to assess and validate what you're being told, and you've got some kind of BS filter to run it through. I think everyone should be doing that, regardless of your starting point. And then when it comes to assessing who you work with and how you work with them, even if you are new to property, if you're in a position where you've got that chunk of money, you've probably built up some skills and some life experience when it comes to assessing people, figuring out how to structure relationships. You've probably done that in whatever the area is that's allowed you to get the money in the first place. So you can bring that across to property. So I think, Rob, for any of these starting points, there is work. It's not like having loads of money means it's going to be easy, means you can turn off your brain and it just happens. There's a different type of work for every starting point, but it's all work.
It is all work, and then it does reduce. That's the good news. Once you put the upfront work in, it then starts to reduce, but you should put the upfront work in, whether it's building that first deposit or building the right team of advisors around you. It still is work. But that's why not everyone does it. Because if property was easy, then everyone up and down the nation would own lots and lots of properties. But it doesn't work that way because it's not easy. But that also should encourage you. Because if you're willing to put that effort in where others aren't, that's where the rewards lie. So whether you're starting out or you've got a lump sum of cash or somewhere in the middle, put that work in and the rewards will come.
Okay, before we finish, time for Hub Extra, the part of the show where we give you that little bit more, a tool, a tip, a resource, something to improve your life in property and beyond. And Rob, I understand that you've left your house recently.
That's big news, right? So last year, you may remember, I talked very enthusiastically about the musical Matilda and just going out to the theatre in general, whether it's the West End or theatres local to you. I think it's really important to support this amazing industry that we have in the UK. Just incredible, talented people. And after COVID, it needed that boost. It needed people to get back in. And I think that is happening, and that's great to see. So you can take that recommendation, go and see what you want, go and see Matilda or other amazing shows. It's completely up to you. But I've picked up one recently, and I just wanted to give it a bit of light, a bit of positivity, because whenever I go to the theatre, I will probably look at reviews, like a lot of people do, because going to the theatre is an expensive experience. There's no hiding that. So because it's not a weekly, monthly affair, at least not for me, then I want to make sure I choose well. Well, I had some tickets purchased for me, and it was for The Wizard of Oz. And I then went to look at the reviews, and I thought, oh dear, this is not going to be a good experience. And I just want to say it was amazing. So I really, really enjoyed it. So I just wanted to give that show some love, because I just feel the reviews were very cruel. I was on my feet at the end, like I often am with these type of things, but just a brilliant show. So going to the theatre is sort of my Hub Extra, but also not always bad reviews means a bad show is my second part of that. So The Wizard of Oz gets some love from me too. But overall, people, what I'm saying is, get out your house as well. You will not regret it. Every time I have things like this, I'm like, oh man, I've got to get out, put effort in. And I always love it. Never have the regret. So your Hub Extra is to take action with your social life.
Yeah, absolutely. The theatre in particular just feels like so much effort, but on the very rare occasions I do it, I always enjoy it. And seeing as I have such poor taste in so many areas of culture, I realise that reviews have absolutely no correlation at all with what I enjoy. So I've certainly not let poor reviews put me off. We will just end the show by giving a quick shout out to listener Mark, who says, I've been a listener of your podcast for a couple of years now. Last year, my business partner and I invested in our first property. Okay, now what might that property be? Like a 2-bed flat, a small detached house maybe? No, we invested in our first property, which was an old backpackers hostel that we converted into a 19-bedroom HMO for students. Who the hell does that as their first investment? Mark, you're insane. But you go on to say, we've completed our first year and it's been going well. So I'm very glad to hear it. I don't think I've ever heard of a more ambitious first project, but congratulations to you. We've talked about taking action a few times in this episode, and that is big action, and I'm glad it's paid off.
I mean, that review just makes me tired listening to it. So I can only imagine the effort and the education, the lessons that have come from that experience. Well done.
Yeah, I know. Unbelievable. We'll be back to share whatever lessons we have to share next Thursday on the Property Podcast, so make sure you join us then. Until then, have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.